In a world where the world's elite are often surrounded by luxury, security, and constant media attention, the story of Barron Trump's unexpected confrontation with airport staff took a shocking turn that no one saw coming. It was an ordinary day at a bustling international airport when Barron Trump, the youngest son of former U.S. President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump, found himself in a situation that no one could have anticipated. Despite his well-known family name and status, airport staff, unfamiliar with the intricacies of his identity at that moment, made a decision that they would soon come to regret. Barron, now a young teenager, had been traveling with his entourage, seemingly just another passenger in a world full of rushed travelers. But when he approached the gate with his security detail, things took a strange turn. The airport staff, perhaps overwhelmed by the chaos of a busy terminal, misjudged the situation and, thinking he was just another traveler trying to bypass security protocols, decided to take matters into their own hands. They did not recognize him immediately, and their first instinct was to enforce the rules strictly, even if it meant removing someone of his caliber from the area. What followed was nothing short of a spectacle. Airport staff, feeling they were acting within the boundaries of protocol, proceeded to escort Barron out of the waiting area. The young man, calm yet confused, was caught off guard by their actions. It was a moment that could have gone unnoticed, lost in the shuffle of everyday travel. But fate had other plans. As Barron stepped away from the scene, news spread like wildfire, and people began to realize the gravity of what had just happened. The tension escalated quickly. The staff, oblivious to the identity of the young man they had just escorted out, would soon realize the monumental mistake they had made. Barron Trump, after all, wasn't just any teenager. He was the son of one of the most recognizable figures in the world, and this was about to become a moment that would be etched into the memories of both the public and the airport staff. As the situation began to unfold, a sense of unease spread throughout the terminal. Staff members began to whisper amongst themselves. How could they have missed it? The young man had the unmistakable air of someone important, someone with a presence that only a few could ignore. It wasn't until Barron's security team arrived, visibly agitated and ready to smooth things over, that the staff realized just who they had kicked out. But the story didn't end there. No, this was only the beginning of what would become a series of events that would make headlines. As the airport staff scrambled to handle the situation, another key figure entered the scene, Melania Trump, Barron's mother. Her arrival sent a ripple of panic through the already tense atmosphere. How would she react to this blunder? What would she say? Would she express anger, disappointment, or perhaps even amusement at the situation? As Melania Trump strode through the terminal, the staff were left to reflect on their actions. The once bustling airport now seemed eerily quiet as the realization set in. It wasn't just a small mistake. They had crossed a line that, in hindsight, felt impossible to undo. What would Melania think? Would the world learn of the airport staff's mistake? Would they face any consequences for their actions? And perhaps most importantly, how would this embarrassing incident affect Barron? These questions hung in the air like a thick fog. The staff, already regretting their actions, could only wait as the story of their error began to spread across social media and news outlets. Meanwhile, Barron stood at the center of it all, trying to make sense of the chaos surrounding him. With Melania's arrival, the tension in the air grew even more palpable. The moment of confrontation had arrived, but the full impact of what was about to unfold remained uncertain. As the minutes ticked by, the airport staff could only hope that the situation would diffuse smoothly. They didn't know what Melania would say, what kind of reaction she would have, or whether this event would become an infamous chapter in the story of the Trump family's legacy. The uncertainty was almost unbearable. Would Melania be as understanding as some hoped, or would she demand accountability for the mistake? And would Barron ever find himself in such an awkward position again? The answers to these questions would soon be revealed, but for now, all the airport staff could do was wait and reflect on their actions. The world was watching, and the next few moments would determine how this story would unfold. The air felt thick with anticipation as Melania Trump's footsteps echoed down the hallway of the airport terminal. Barron stood silently, surrounded by his security team, still processing the absurdity of what had just unfolded. He wasn't used to being in the spotlight. Sure, being the son of a former president had its challenges, but most of his life had been lived under the radar. This was different. This was a public incident that was already making waves across social media. The airport staff, now realizing the monumental mistake they had made, tried to maintain a sense of professionalism, but their nerves were palpable. The young man they had just escorted out of the waiting area was no ordinary passenger. It had all happened so quickly, the mix-up, the confusion, the hasty decision to remove him from the premises. If only they had recognized Barron sooner, things could have been so different. But now there was no turning back. The staff members exchanged anxious glances as they awaited Melania's arrival. They knew they were in for a difficult conversation, but how much worse could this situation get? Barron, for his part, was more stunned than angry. He had grown accustomed to the strange looks, the whispers, and the way people sometimes treated him like he was someone special. But he had never experienced anything like this. Being publicly removed from an airport gate by staff who hadn't even recognized him felt surreal. He hadn't even been given the chance to explain himself before the situation escalated. He had been calm, composed, and trying to go about his day as any other young traveler would, but now the situation had spiraled out of control. All he wanted was to get to his destination without causing a scene. His mind raced as he stood there, waiting for his mother's arrival. Melania Trump, a woman known for her grace and poise, was always able to handle stressful situations with a calm demeanor. But Barron knew that even she would be shocked by the turn of events. Would she be angry? Would she be understanding? Or would she handle it in her own quiet way, demanding that everything be smoothed over without causing further tension? Barron had no idea. As the seconds ticked by, the noise of the terminal seemed to fade into the background. The bustling crowd, the chatter of passengers, the sound of rolling suitcases, all of it became muffled as Barron's thoughts drifted to the events that had led him here. He couldn't help but think about how quickly things had escalated. Just moments ago, he had been standing at the gate, about to board a flight like any other person. But now he was at the center of a controversy he hadn't seen coming. The security team, ever watchful and alert, exchanged a few quiet words with each other. They had been trained for high-stakes situations, but this was different. They were used to protecting Barron from the press, from the constant attention, but this incident had been entirely unpredictable. They had always known that their job wasn't just about physical protection. It was about managing delicate situations, diffusing tensions, and maintaining the image of the Trump family at all costs. But this time, even they were unsure how to navigate the storm that was brewing. In the distance, Barron saw her, Melania. Tall, elegant and composed as always, she moved through the crowd with a quiet confidence. Her presence immediately drew attention, and the whispers started again. There was no mistaking who she was, and the staff now stood on edge, realizing that they were about to face the consequences of their earlier actions. Barron felt a strange sense of relief wash over him as his mother approached. She always had a way of making things better, of calming the storm when it seemed like everything was falling apart. But this time, it wasn't going to be easy. Melania's gaze shifted from Barron to the staff members who had made the grave mistake of removing him from the gate. She didn't speak at first, her sharp eyes taking in the situation. The airport staff stood there, frozen, waiting for her to speak. The tension in the air was thick, and the sound of distant chatter faded as everyone waited for Melania's next move. She had always been known for her quiet demeanor, but everyone knew that behind that calm exterior was someone who didn't tolerate mistakes, especially when it involved her family. "Excuse me," Melania finally said, her voice soft yet firm. "Can someone explain to me what happened here?" Her words were calm, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of authority in her tone. She was not one to make a scene, but when it came to her son, she had no tolerance for incompetence. The airport staff, now realizing the gravity of the situation, began to stammer their apologies. We thought there was a mix-up, ma'am," one of the staff members began, her voice shaky. "We didn't recognize him at first, and we thought he was trying to bypass security protocols. It was a misunderstanding. We never meant to cause any trouble." Melania's gaze didn't soften. She understood mistakes, but this was more than a simple error. She took a step closer to the staff, her presence commanding attention. Barron stood silently behind her, watching the exchange with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. "You didn't recognize him?" Melania asked, her voice growing more pointed. "You didn't recognize my son? How could that happen?" There was a brief pause as the staff tried to find the right words to explain. The atmosphere in the terminal had shifted from confusion to discomfort. People were watching, some quietly filming the exchange, others whispering amongst themselves. The incident had already gained attention, and it seemed like everyone had an opinion. The staff could only offer their apologies, but it was clear that the situation had already spiraled out of their control. They had underestimated Barron, not realizing the importance of his identity, and now they were left to face the consequences. Melania, however, didn't seem eager to escalate the situation further. She took a deep breath, her posture remaining poised, but there was a palpable tension in the air as she glanced over at Barron. He had always been a quiet young man, not one to seek attention, but this moment would mark a shift. Her attention turned back to the staff. "This needs to be handled properly," she said, her tone final. "Make sure this doesn't happen again." As Melania walked away, Barron at her side, the staff could only watch in silence. They had misjudged the situation, and now they would have to live with the fallout. Would the world forgive them? Would they find a way to restore the fragile trust they had broken? As the tension in the terminal slowly began to dissipate, the staff knew that this was far from over. The story was far from finished. As Barron and Melania made their way through the terminal, a cold silence lingered around them. The air was thick with curiosity, with people whispering to each other about the encounter that had just transpired. It was clear to anyone watching that this was no ordinary family. The ripple effect of Barron being escorted out of the gate had sent waves through the terminal, and while the situation had calmed, the weight of what had just happened hung in the air like an unresolved question. Melania's eyes remained focused ahead, but Barron, walking closely beside her, couldn't shake the sense of embarrassment that had settled in his chest. He was used to being in the background, rarely in the spotlight. His whole life had been carefully curated to avoid such public mishaps, and yet here he was, the subject of an incident that no one could easily forget. It wasn't just a matter of being recognized, it was about the assumptions made by those who should have known better. For a brief moment, Barron wondered how much of this was a result of his family's past, their presence in the public eye, the constant media attention, the expectations placed on them. As they walked, Barron tried to keep his composure, but the eyes of every passerby felt like 1,000 needles against his skin. The weight of the public's gaze was something he had learned to tune out over the years, but today it was impossible to ignore. The whispers, the stares, it all felt like a spectacle unfolding in real time. He wanted to disappear, to escape the scene, but the more he tried to ignore it, the more it consumed him. How would this affect his reputation? What would the media say? Would they paint him as a victim of an overzealous airport staff, or would they twist the story into something more sensational? Behind the scenes, the airport staff was still reeling from the mistake they had made. Some had already begun to speculate on how to cover up their blunder, others were wondering if they would face any real consequences. The staff members who had been directly involved were doing their best to stay calm, but it was clear they were under pressure. Would the higher-ups be understanding? Or would they be forced to issue an apology that could affect their careers? The thought of dealing with the fallout from such a high-profile mistake loomed over them like a storm cloud. They had failed to recognize Barron, and that misstep had already started to spread like wildfire. As the staff huddled in a corner, quietly discussing what to do next, one of them, a young woman named Clara, found herself feeling a strange mix of guilt and curiosity. She had been the one to suggest that Barron should be escorted out when the confusion first arose. She had acted quickly, thinking she was doing her job, ensuring that security protocols were followed. But now, in the aftermath, she couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to the story, something she didn't understand at first. Could Barron's family have influenced her decision? Could the weight of their reputation have caused her to react differently than she would have in any other circumstance? Clara's mind raced as she thought about the broader implications of her actions. She had never been in a situation like this before, and she didn't know how to navigate the murky waters of public relations and accountability. Meanwhile, across the terminal, Melania had led Barron to a quiet corner, away from the public eye. She could feel the tension in the air, the judgment from the bystanders who were watching their every move. The press would undoubtedly get a hold of the story, and it would spread far beyond the airport walls. She didn't want to make a scene, but she could see how much this was affecting Barron. She could see the way he was trying to hide his discomfort, his natural tendency to retreat into himself when faced with conflict. It reminded her of his younger years when he would withdraw into books or video games, avoiding the harshness of the world around him. "Barron," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Her voice was calm, but there was a certain steel to it. "You know this is not your fault. You did nothing wrong." Barron nodded but didn't speak. He had heard those words before from his mother, from his father, from people who tried to comfort him. But today, those words didn't seem to offer much solace. The reality was that this incident, this public mistake, had happened, and there was no way to take it back. "I know," he muttered, but his eyes remained distant, staring out the window, as if hoping the world outside would offer an escape. Melania's heart ached for him. She had always been protective of Barron, watching over him as he navigated a world that seemed set on scrutinizing every aspect of his life. But this was something else. This was a public humiliation, and it wasn't just about a mistake, it was about perception. Melania had spent years cultivating an image of grace, dignity, and composure, but even she knew how quickly things could spiral out of control. She wondered what the media would say, how they would frame the narrative. In the distance, the murmur of voices grew louder as more people caught wind of the incident. Smartphones flashed as bystanders filmed the aftermath of the altercation. The story had already taken root, and soon it would be everywhere. The tabloids, the news outlets, the endless social media threads. Would the airport staff be blamed? Would they be vilified for their actions, or would people sympathize with them, claiming it was simply a misunderstanding? It didn't matter how the media portrayed it. What mattered was that Barron's name was now part of the narrative, and that was something he couldn't undo. As Melania and Barron stood there, the weight of the moment felt heavier than ever. She could see it in Barron's eyes. He was retreating into himself, shutting out the world. It was something he had done before when faced with overwhelming emotions. She didn't want him to retreat, but she also understood why he was doing it. Sometimes it felt safer to withdraw than to face the harshness of the world head-on. For now, Melania knew she had to be the one to take charge. She had to navigate this situation with the same poise and resolve that had gotten her through so many others. But as she glanced around, watching the staff scurry nervously in the background, she couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was just the beginning of something far more complicated. What would happen when the full details of the story came to light? How would the public react when they learned the truth? Melania didn't have the answers, but she knew one thing for certain: the road ahead would not be an easy one. And whatever came next, she would face it head-on, just as she always had. The moments that followed felt like they stretched into eternity. The soft hum of the terminal, once filled with the noise of hurried travelers, now seemed almost suffocating. Barron and Melania remained in their corner, the world around them pressing in, a constant reminder of the situation they found themselves in. Barron had grown quiet again, his thoughts lost in a storm of uncertainty and frustration. Every passing second felt like a hammer blow to his sense of normalcy. He couldn't help but think that his entire life had been leading up to this moment, This moment of public judgment, he couldn't escape it. It was as if he had been thrust into the spotlight, whether he liked it or not. Melania, however, remained focused. Her mind raced, calculating the next steps, anticipating the fallout. She had been in situations like this before, dealing with media scrutiny, public opinion, and the constant weight of being under a microscope. But this was different. This was her son, and no matter how much she tried to remain composed, the fear that gripped her was undeniable. She didn't want this incident to define Barron, to leave a stain on his life that he would never shake off. The quiet intensity in her eyes reflected her determination to shield him, to protect him from the storm that was coming. She looked around the terminal once more, her gaze flicking over the few people who had gathered to watch, others who were still filming the scene on their phones. It was only a matter of time before the media descended on the story. What would they say? What kind of headlines would the tabloids produce? Melania's mind flashed with the worst-case scenarios, each one more absurd than the last. She couldn't let the narrative spin out of control. Not now, not when Barron was already so vulnerable. The staff members who had been involved in the earlier incident were still huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. Clara, the young woman who had been directly responsible for asking Barron to leave, stood apart from the others. She kept her eyes on the floor, too afraid to look anyone in the eye. The guilt she felt was overwhelming. She had never meant for things to escalate the way they had. She had only been trying to follow procedure, but now the weight of that decision felt crushing. She wondered what the consequences would be. Would she lose her job? Would her reputation be tarnished forever? All she could think about was how the situation had spiraled out of control, and now there was nothing she could do to undo the damage. She had recognized the mistake too late, and the moment of opportunity to make things right had already passed. The clock on the wall ticked away, and with every second that passed, the pressure mounted. The anxiety in the air was palpable. Melania could feel her pulse quickening as she scanned the terminal again. She knew that she needed to address the media soon. The longer they stayed silent, the more they risked fueling the growing fire. But she had to be careful. One wrong move, one poorly chosen word, and this entire incident could spiral further into chaos. Barron shifted uncomfortably beside her, his eyes fixed on the floor. Melania could sense his unease, his discomfort with the attention that had suddenly turned toward him. He had never asked for this. No one had, really. They had always tried to give him as normal a life as possible under extraordinary circumstances. And yet, in that moment, everything felt out of control. The fact that something as trivial as a misunderstanding at an airport had the potential to affect his life so profoundly seemed surreal. She could see how the weight of it was pressing down on him. She needed to act quickly, but first, she needed to know exactly how to proceed. What was the right choice for Barron? As the minutes passed, Melania began to feel the urgency of the situation. The whispers grew louder, and the subtle murmur of the crowd hinted that news outlets were starting to take interest. What was happening at that airport wasn't just a family matter anymore. It had become a public spectacle, one that threatened to tarnish their carefully curated image. Melania knew that their next move would be crucial. They had to regain control of the narrative, but how? The airport's PR team had already been alerted, and they were frantically working behind the scenes to manage the fallout. They knew that if the media got hold of the wrong version of events, it could spell disaster for the Trump family. Rumors were already beginning to circulate online, with people speculating wildly about the reasons behind the incident. Some were already calling it an airport scandal, while others wondered whether it had been an intentional slight by the staff. Was Barron being targeted because of his family's political connections, or had it just been a case of overzealous security? Melania's phone buzzed, the screen flashing with a notification. It was from the PR team. They were advising her to make a statement, to diffuse the tension before it escalated any further. The message was clear. If they didn't take control soon, it would be too late. Barron looked up at her then, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and frustration. "Mom, do we have to say something?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost defeated. Melania placed a hand on his shoulder, her expression softening. "We will. But we'll do it the right way," she said, her voice firm. "We'll make sure the truth is heard. You have nothing to apologize for, Barron." Barron nodded, but his gaze drifted to the crowd again. The world was waiting. The pressure was building, and soon the story would break wide open. In that moment, everything seemed to hinge on what would happen next. Would the airport staff apologize publicly? Would the media paint Barron as a victim, or would they spin the narrative in a way that would haunt him for years to come? In the midst of all the noise, Melania felt the weight of the decision she had to make. Every instinct told her that the right words, measured, careful, would steer the situation back on course. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something far more complex. The tension between her family's public image and the personal cost of their notoriety had never been more apparent. What would the world think of them after this? Would they ever be able to regain the balance they had worked so hard to maintain? As the clock ticked down, the moment of truth was fast approaching. How far would this incident go? Would it burn out in a few days, or would it take on a life of its own, dragging Barron and the Trump family further into the spotlight than they had ever intended? The questions hung heavy in the air, unanswered, as the tension in the terminal continued to build, leaving everyone wondering, how would it all end? As the tension in the terminal reached a near breaking point, something unexpected happened. Just as Melania was about to send a carefully worded statement to the PR team, a figure appeared from the crowd, an airport security manager, his face flushed with anxiety. He rushed toward Melania and Barron, his footsteps quick and purposeful, cutting through the thick air of uncertainty. Melania looked up, a wave of concern washing over her as she met his gaze. Something was wrong. His expression, a mixture of nervousness and urgency, told her everything she needed to know. "Mrs. Trump, sir," he began, his voice low and filled with regret. "We need to speak with you immediately. There's been a development." Melania's instincts flared. She hadn't anticipated any more complications, especially not at this critical juncture. What more could happen? What else could possibly go wrong? But before she could respond, the manager quickly added, "I'm afraid there's been another issue, involving the footage that was captured of the incident." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Footage. There had been people filming, yes, but she hadn't thought much of it. It was standard these days, people with their phones, capturing moments without thinking about the consequences. But now, as the manager's eyes flicked toward the phone in his hand, it became clear that the footage wasn't just innocent bystanders taking photos. No, this was something far worse. The video that had already started circulating online was far more than a simple recording of a mistake. It was a carefully edited clip, one that had been manipulated to create an entirely different narrative. In the footage, Barron appeared not just to be escorted out of the terminal, but to be treated with blatant hostility. The edited version of the video suggested that the airport staff had targeted him, an attempt to single him out, driven by an underlying animosity towards his family. It was a stark contrast to the reality of the situation, where there had been confusion, yes, but no malice. And yet, in this manipulated clip, Barron was shown being escorted out forcibly, his face twisted with an expression that looked far more like distress than what had truly been happening. Melania's stomach dropped as the full weight of the situation began to unfold before her. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. Someone had orchestrated this. The carefully edited footage had been shared across social media platforms, gaining traction by the minute. It was being picked up by news outlets, fueled by people eager to speculate. What was the story now? That Barron had been mistreated, perhaps even wrongfully harassed. The version that was spreading wasn't just damaging, it was potentially catastrophic. The public perception of the incident was shifting, and not in their favor. "Who did this?" Melania asked, her voice calm, but laced with a quiet fury. She couldn't afford to lose her composure now. This wasn't just about Barron anymore, it was about control. The narrative had been hijacked and she needed to take it back. I don't know, the security manager stammered, but we've been trying to get ahead of it. It's already gone viral. We're working with the authorities to track the source of the footage, but the damage is already being done. A sickening realization hit Melania. Whoever was behind this had done it with precision, ensuring that the footage reached the right people at the right time, just when the situation was at its most volatile. She knew how fast things could spiral out of control once the media got hold of the wrong story. She had seen it happen countless times before, but this was different. This wasn't just a PR misstep or a small mistake. This was something calculated, a deliberate attempt to tear apart her family's image. Barron, who had been quiet up until that point, spoke up, his voice almost a whisper. "What do we do now, Mom?" The question hung in the air, heavy with the uncertainty that now surrounded them. Melania looked at her son, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his eyes. She had promised him that they would handle this together, but now the landscape had changed entirely. She couldn't shield him from this, not without taking a stand. But what could they do when the story had already taken on a life of its own? Just then, Melania's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from one of her most trusted advisors. It wasn't just the footage causing chaos now. Rumors had started circulating that the edited video was part of a much bigger conspiracy. There were whispers about how the incident had been deliberately planned to cause damage to her family's reputation. The theory was that someone had staged the entire thing, from the airport staff's confusion to the doctored video, all in an attempt to manipulate the public's perception of them. The air felt thick with tension. How could anyone have orchestrated such a thing? Who stood to gain from sabotaging Barron, from turning a simple mistake into a full-blown scandal? Melania's mind raced as she tried to piece together the puzzle. Could it have been someone with a vendetta against her family? A rival political group? Or was it something more personal, someone with an axe to grind with the Trump family specifically? The stakes were higher than ever, and Melania knew she couldn't let the situation continue unchecked. But the deeper she dug, the more complicated it became. Every lead seemed to spiral into a new web of questions. Who was behind the conspiracy? What was their endgame? And more importantly, what could they do to stop it? She glanced at Barron, his face pale as he tried to make sense of the whirlwind around him. Melania's heart went out to him. He didn't deserve any of this. But she knew now that the situation was far from over. In fact, it had just reached a tipping point. The manipulated footage, the viral rumors, it wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was a full-scale attack, and Melania couldn't help but wonder, how much further would they go to destroy her family's reputation? Would they stop at nothing? The tension was unbearable, and in that moment, one thing was certain: the worst was still yet to come. The minutes ticked by, and the tension in the terminal was suffocating. Melania's mind was racing, trying to piece together the complex web of lies and manipulation that had been spun around her family. She could feel the walls closing in. Every passing moment brought them closer to the edge of something they couldn't control. She knew that if she didn't act fast, the story would slip entirely out of their grasp. Barron's future, her family's reputation, everything was on the line. The stakes had never been higher. Melania's phone buzzed again, breaking the oppressive silence. This time, it was from her PR team. They had tracked the origin of the video. Someone had leaked it deliberately. The footage had come from a security camera inside the terminal, but it was evident that it had been altered. A quick investigation revealed that the edits weren't just random. They had been done by someone with knowledge of how to manipulate footage to create a narrative that wasn't there. The culprit was a disgruntled airport employee, someone who had been recently let go. This individual had an axe to grind and had taken it out on the family by staging the incident and leaking the altered footage to the media. Melania felt a mix of relief and rage wash over her. She had suspected something like this, but now the truth was laid bare. They had been targeted, and all of this, every uncomfortable moment, every second of anxiety, had been part of someone's twisted scheme. She took a deep breath, her mind already working out the next steps. The situation wasn't over yet, but the truth had come to light, and now they had the power to reclaim the narrative. She looked at Barron, who seemed to relax slightly as the weight of the moment began to ease. His expression had softened, but there was still a lingering wariness in his eyes. Melania placed a hand on his shoulder, offering him a reassuring squeeze. "We'll fix this, Barron. The truth is on our side." Just as Melania was about to send a statement to the press, another surprise hit. A representative from the airport's legal team approached her, his face tense. He informed her that they had already contacted the authorities about the leaked footage and that the responsible employee was being investigated. It was clear that the airport was trying to distance itself from the incident, but the damage had already been done. There was no going back. In that moment, as Melania processed the information, she heard the unmistakable sound of a camera shutter clicking nearby. A small group of reporters had gathered, their cameras pointed at her. It seemed like the moment had arrived. The storm had reached its peak. But instead of feeling the panic that had consumed her earlier, Melania found herself calm, collected. She knew what needed to be done. It was time to take control once and for all. With Barron by her side, Melania stepped forward, her gaze steady as she addressed the growing crowd. She didn't mince words. She explained the situation, detailing how the footage had been deliberately manipulated and the person responsible had been identified. She spoke with authority, making it clear that they would not allow their family's reputation to be tarnished by a deliberate lie. The press, for once, seemed to listen. The cameras snapped in rapid succession as she laid out the facts, addressing the scandal head-on, refusing to let the lies stand. But just as Melania finished her statement, a final, unexpected twist left the entire room stunned. A new video emerged. This one was not altered. It showed the actual moment the incident had occurred, raw and unfiltered. In it, Barron was seen speaking to the airport staff, trying to remain calm despite the mounting confusion. The video was a stark contrast to the manipulated version that had gone viral. It showed him not being escorted out with hostility, but rather in a brief, tense interaction that quickly escalated due to misunderstandings. There was no malice in the exchange, just a young boy caught in the middle of an overblown situation. But it wasn't just the footage that took everyone by surprise. The twist came when the security manager from earlier stepped forward with a statement. He confirmed that Barron had, in fact, shown incredible patience during the ordeal. He had been polite, understanding, and cooperative throughout, even when the situation had spiraled out of control. The airport manager's admission was a game-changer. It completely undermined the narrative of mistreatment that had been building in the media. The revelations stunned the crowd. It was a powerful moment, a clear shift in the story's direction. The new footage, combined with the manager's statement, shifted the tide in Melania's favor. It wasn't just about exposing the lies anymore. It was about reclaiming her son's dignity and undoing the damage caused by the viral video. The press had no choice but to acknowledge the truth. As the news outlets began to pivot, it became clear that the story was changing, and fast. The public's perception of Barron was being restored. For a brief moment, Melania allowed herself to exhale. They had done it. They had turned the tide in their favor. Barron's name would no longer be tarnished by the malicious narrative that had almost consumed them. But even as she felt the relief wash over her, Melania knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. The forces behind the manipulation of the footage were still out there, and the story wasn't fully resolved. Just as she was about to leave the terminal with Barron, a figure stepped forward from the crowd. A familiar face, someone she hadn't expected to see in that moment. It was the very airport employee who had been fired and responsible for leaking the footage. But this time, he wasn't holding a camera. Instead, he was holding a briefcase. His eyes were filled with a strange mix of defiance and fear. Before Melania could say anything, he looked straight at her and uttered a single sentence that sent a chill through the air. "There's more to this than you think, and you're not the only one being played." The room fell silent. Melania's heart skipped a beat as the mystery deepened. She thought the conflict had been resolved, but it was clear now. They were only scratching the surface of something far larger than they had ever imagined. The final twist had arrived, and the game was far from over. The words the airport employee had just spoken hung in the air, heavy and cryptic. Melania's heart pounded in her chest, and she couldn't help but feel a surge of unease. "You're not the only one being played." What did that mean? Was this a final attempt to further complicate the situation, or was there truth in his words? She had no time to waste, especially not after everything they had already endured. Before she could respond, the man's face twisted with a strange mix of urgency and fear. "I didn't just leak the footage," he confessed in a hushed tone, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "I was forced to. There are others who stand to gain far more from this than you think." His eyes flickered nervously, as if the truth was a burden he could no longer bear. Melania, who had been expecting some sort of last-ditch attempt to shift blame, now felt a chilling sense of realization creeping over her. She could tell this wasn't just some random act of malice or a simple case of someone seeking revenge. There was something deeper at play, something far bigger than a manipulated video or a disgruntled employee. Who are you talking about?" Melania's voice was steady, though inside, her mind was racing, piecing together the fractured details. Barron, standing beside her, looked just as bewildered, not fully understanding the complexity of what was unfolding in front of him. The man hesitated, then took a deep breath. "There's a group, a network of people who are orchestrating these kinds of things. They have connections everywhere. Politics, media, even in places you wouldn't think to look." He lowered his voice even further. "They've been targeting your family for years, planting stories, creating controversy, manipulating the public. This video, it's just one piece of a much larger puzzle." The revelation sent a shockwave through Melania. She had always known that her family had enemies, but hearing that there was a well-organized network working against them on this scale was something she hadn't fully grasped until now. It made sense in a terrifying way. The timing of the viral video, the way it had spread so quickly, and the speed with which the media had jumped on it, it all pointed to something more calculated, more intentional than just a random incident. "You need to expose them," the man continued, his voice trembling now. "I can help you. I can give you names, contacts, but you have to act fast. They're already moving. If you don't stop them now, they'll just come at you from another angle. They won't stop until they've destroyed everything." Melania felt a chill run down her spine. She had been fighting for her son, for her family's reputation, but this was something much bigger. The stakes had been raised to a level she hadn't anticipated. The man's words were like a red flag, signaling that the fight for her family's name was only just beginning. With a heavy sigh, Melania looked at Barron. "We need to go. I'll take care of this." She knew that this wasn't just about one incident anymore. The battle had shifted into something far more dangerous, a web of power and deceit that would require all of her strength and determination to untangle. She couldn't afford to let fear or uncertainty dictate their next steps. As they made their way out of the terminal, Melania's mind was already working. There were too many unanswered questions. Who exactly was behind this network? How far did their influence stretch? What were their true motives? She couldn't afford to waste time pondering it, though. She needed action. She needed to protect her family, and she needed to put an end to this once and for all. Over the next few days, Melania threw herself into the investigation, reaching out to trusted allies and leveraging every resource at her disposal. The more she uncovered, the more it became clear that the network the employee had spoken about was real. It was a shadowy group, operating from the shadows, with tentacles in politics, business, and media. They had orchestrated countless smear campaigns over the years, planting false stories and manipulating public perception to suit their agenda. Melania's family wasn't the only target, but they were one of the most high-profile. With the help of her team, she worked tirelessly to expose the players behind the scheme. The deeper they dug, the more shocking the revelations became. But as Melania connected the dots, a clearer picture emerged. This wasn't just about tarnishing her family's reputation. It was part of a larger, far-reaching effort to destabilize key figures and shift power dynamics in ways that most people couldn't even begin to understand. The revelations hit the media in a way that no one had anticipated. When the full story came out, names, connections, and the scale of the operation, there was an overwhelming sense of shock. The public, who had once rallied around the manipulated footage of Barron's incident, now found themselves questioning everything. The media, which had so eagerly bought into the narrative of mistreatment, quickly shifted gears. As more facts came to light, the tide turned in Melania's favor. The employee who had confessed to leaking the footage cooperated with authorities, and soon others involved in the network were brought to light. There were arrests, investigations, and public hearings. The group that had been working from the shadows to manipulate public opinion was slowly, but surely being dismantled. As the dust settled, Melania couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. It hadn't been an easy fight, and there had been moments when she wasn't sure they would make it out unscathed. But in the end, the truth had prevailed. Barron, who had been at the center of the storm, was able to return to his life with a sense of dignity restored, of malice or a simple case of someone seeking revenge. There was something deeper at play, something far bigger than a manipulated video or a disgruntled employee. Who are you talking about? Melania's voice was steady, though inside, her mind was racing, piecing together the fractured details. Barron, standing beside her, looked just as bewildered, not fully understanding the complexity of what was unfolding in front of him. The man hesitated, then took a deep breath. There's a group, a network of people who are orchestrating these kinds of things. They have connections everywhere. Politics, media, even in places you wouldn't think to look. He lowered his voice even further. They've been targeting your family for years, planting stories, creating controversy, manipulating the public. This video, it's just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The revelation sent a shockwave through Melania. She had always known that her family had enemies, but hearing that there was a well-organized network working against them on this scale was something she hadn't fully grasped until now. It made sense in a terrifying way. The timing of the viral video, the way it had spread so quickly, and the speed with which the media had jumped on it, it all pointed to something more calculated, more intentional than just a random incident. You need to expose them, the man continued, his voice trembling now. I can help you. I can give you names, contacts, but you have to act fast. They're already moving. If you don't stop them now, they'll just come at you from another angle. They won't stop until they've destroyed everything. Melania felt a chill run down her spine. She had been fighting for her son, for her family's reputation, but this was something much bigger. The stakes had been raised to a level she hadn't anticipated. The man's words were like a red flag, signaling that the fight for her family's name was only just beginning. With a heavy sigh, Melania looked at Barron. We need to go. I'll take care of this. She knew that this wasn't just about one incident anymore. The battle had shifted into something far more dangerous, a web of power and deceit that would require all of her strength and determination to untangle. She couldn't afford to let fear or uncertainty dictate their next steps. As they made their way out of the terminal, Melania's mind was already working. There were too many unanswered questions. Who exactly was behind this network? How far did their influence stretch? What were their true motives? She couldn't afford to waste time pondering it, though. She needed action. She needed to protect her family, and she needed to put an end to this once and for all. Over the next few days, Melania threw herself into the investigation, reaching out to trusted allies and leveraging every resource at her disposal. The more she uncovered, the more it became clear that the network the employee had spoken about was real. It was a shadowy group, operating from the shadows, with tentacles in politics, business, and media. They had orchestrated countless smear campaigns over the years, planting false stories and manipulating public perception to suit their agenda. Melania's family wasn't the only target, but they were one of the most high-profile. With the help of her team, she worked tirelessly to expose the players behind the scheme. The deeper they dug, the more shocking the revelations became. But as Melania connected the dots, a clearer picture emerged. This wasn't just about tarnishing her family's reputation. It was part of a larger, far-reaching effort to destabilize key figures and shift power dynamics in ways that most people couldn't even begin to understand. The revelations hit the media in a way that no one had anticipated. When the full story came out, names, connections, and the scale of the operation, there was an overwhelming sense of shock. The public, who had once rallied around the manipulated footage of Barron's incident, now found themselves questioning everything. The media, which had so eagerly bought into the narrative of mistreatment, quickly shifted gears. As more facts came to light, the tide turned in Melania's favor. The employee who had confessed to leaking the footage cooperated with authorities, and soon others involved in the network were brought to light. There were arrests, investigations, and public hearings. The group that had been working from the shadows to manipulate public opinion was slowly, but surely being dismantled. As the dust settled, Melania couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. It hadn't been an easy fight, and there had been moments when she wasn't sure they would make it out unscathed. But in the end, the truth had prevailed. Barron, who had been at the center of the storm, was able to return to his life with a sense of dignity restored. But even as things began to return to normal, Melania knew this experience had changed her forever. She had learned just how far people were willing to go to manipulate the truth, to twist reality for their own gain. And she knew that this was just one battle in a much larger war. There would always be those who would try to tear her family down, who would do whatever it took to destroy what they had built. But in the end, Melania understood that no matter how many people tried to tear them apart, the truth would always win. She had fought for her family, for Barron's dignity, and for the integrity of their name. And as long as she had the strength to stand up, they would continue to fight for what was right. In the end, the story of Barron's mistaken incident became a testament not just to the power of truth, but to the resilience of those willing to stand against the odds, even when the world seemed determined to bring them down.